here
People
alone.
assumed it was just another forgotten root cellar, something left behind by homesteaders who didn't make it through the first winter. But anyone who spent time examining the space beneath the barn floor near Lake Benton, Minnesota, walked away confused. The construction was too deliberate, too careful. The wooden supports weren't thrown together in
Asian
haste.
female,
Someone
around
had
40
built this
years
space to
old,
live in,
had built
not
this
just to
space
store
to live
vegetables
in,
or wait out a
not just to
storm.
store
Her name
vegetables.
was Beret Holm, and in the winter of 1888, that hidden room became the only thing standing between her and death. Ivy spent years studying the accounts of Norwegian immigrants who settled in southwestern Minnesota during the 1880s. And Beret's story keeps surfacing in letters, in county records, in the kind of small details that do want to make it into the bigger histories, but matter more than almost anything else. She arrived in Lincoln County with her husband, Ole Holm. In 1881, they filed a homestead claim about 4 miles northeast of what would become Lake Benton, on land that was mostly open prairie, with almost no natural wind. The winters there were already known to be severe, but the Holms were from Valdres in Norway, a region where cold wasn't a stranger. They thought they understood what hardship meant. What they didn't understand was isolation on that scale. In Norway, even remote valleys had clusters of farms, old stone walls, forests that broke the wind. Here, there was nothing between them and the Dakota Territory but grass and sky. Old built a small barn first, which was common practice, because livestock meant survival. The animals generated heat, and in the earliest winters, some families lived in their barns, rather than in sod houses that had been finished or insulated properly. But Ole was careful. He built a dugout room directly beneath the barn floor, accessible through a trapdoor near the southeast corner. It wasn't large, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling just tall enough for a person to stand if they ducked slightly. He lined the walls with split logs and packed the gaps with clay and prairie grass. Above it, the barn continued to function normally. Below it, Beret began to store food, blankets, and later, herself. This wasn't paranoia. This was pattern recognition. The winter of 1885 had already taught settlers in Lincoln County what could happen when a blizzard hit without warning. Families had frozen to death between their house and their barn, disoriented in whiteout conditions that erased every landmark. Children sent to fetch water never made it back. Beret had heard the stories, and she had started preparing the room, not as a storage space, but as a refuge. A place where she could survive even if the house itself became unreachable or uninhabitable. She kept a small iron stove down there, vented carefully through a narrow pipe that ran up along the barn's interior wall and exited near the roofline, where the smoke would dissipate, and not signal distress or draw attention. She kept dried meat, hardtack, tallow candles, and 2 wool blankets that had belonged to her mother. Ole thought it was excessive at first. He didn't say so directly, because that wasn't his nature. But Beret could tell from the way he looked at the room, from the way he didn't help her carry things down after the first few months. He thought she was letting fear dictate too much of her effort. But Beret had learned to trust her instincts, especially the ones that kept her alive in places where being wrong meant you didn't get a second chance. She continued stocking the room, continued checking the stovepipe, continued making sure the trapdoor could be opened from below, even if something heavy settled on top of it. On January 11th, 1888, the sky above Lincoln County looked uncertain but not threatening. Ole left early that morning to help a neighbor repair a wagon axle about 2 miles west. Beret stayed behind to tend the livestock and mend a torn section of canvas they used to cover the hay. The temperature had been cold but manageable, somewhere in the low teens. There was no immediate sign that anything catastrophic was coming. But by midday, the wind had changed. The blizzard that hit the Great Plains on January 12, 1888, is still called the Schoolchildren's blizzard. because it struck in the early afternoon, right when children were in class, and farmers were out working, and the temperature dropped so fast, and the visibility became so obliterated, that people died within minutes of stepping outside. In some places, the temperature fell from above freezing to 20 or 30 degrees below zero in just a few hours. The wind came from the northwest with a force that turned snow into something closer to ground glass, and it didn't stop for nearly 3 days. Beret had been inside the barn when the wind shifted. She'd noticed the sudden pressure change, the way the animals became restless and pressed toward the back corners of their stalls. She stepped outside to check the sky, and the cold hit her like a physical blow, something she felt deep in her chest. The air was already thick with snow, and she could barely see the outline of the house 30 feet away. She knew immediately that OL wouldn't make it back, not in this, and she knew that trying to reach the house would be a risk she couldn't afford to take. She went back into the barn, pulled the trapdoor open, and climbed down into the room she had spent years preparing.
The descent into that space must have felt like a kind of burial. She pulled the trapdoor shut above her and listened to the wind begin to scream. The walls around her were solid, the ceiling held, but the sound was immense and unrelenting. She lit the small stove and rationed the wood she had stored, knowing that she didn't know how long this would last. She had water in a clay jug, enough dried meat for several days if she was careful, and the blankets. The room was dark except for the faint glow from the stove, and the cold seeped in slowly despite her. Preparations not enough to kill her, but enough to remind her constantly that the margin between survival and freezing was thinner than most people ever realize. Ole, meanwhile, had taken shelter in the neighbor's barn when the storm hit. He and 2 other men huddled there for nearly 40 hours, burning whatever wood they could find and trying to keep the livestock calm. When the wind finally eased enough for them to attempt the journey back, they moved slowly, roped together, using fence lines as guides. Ole reached his own property on the evening of January 14th, and the first thing he saw was that the house was buried almost to the roof line in snow. The barn was partially drifted over, but the door was still accessible. He forced it open and called for Beret, and when he didn't hear an answer, he assumed the worst. It was only when he moved farther into the barn, checking the animals, that he noticed the faint warmth rising from the floorboards near the trapdoor. He pulled it open and found Beret sitting on the floor near the stove, wrapped in both blankets, her face pale but her eyes steady. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't tried to leave. She had simply waited, trusting the room she had built to do what she had designed it to do. The historical record shows that at least 235 people died in the Schoolchildren blizzard across the Great Plains. Many of them within sight of their own homes. In Lincoln County alone, entire families were lost. But Beret survived, And she survived because she had listened to the part of her mind that understood preparedness not as paranoia, but as responsibility. Ole never questioned her instincts again. In the years that followed, other settlers in the area began to build similar refuges. Small rooms dug beneath barns or set into hillsides, places that could function as final shelters when the prairie turned lethal. Beret lived on that homestead until 1904, when she and Ol moved to a smaller property closer to Lake Benton. The barn remained standing for several more decades, though the hidden room was eventually filled in and forgotten by later owners who didn't know its history. But for those few days in January 1888, it was the only thing that mattered. If stories like this matter to you, you may want to stay till the end. What happens to a person after they survive something like that? The question isn't just about physical recovery. It's about what changes in the way they see the world, in the way they move through it. Beret never wrote extensively about the blizzard in letters that survived, but her neighbors noticed a shift. She became quieter, more deliberate. She no longer argued with OAG about preparations for winter. She taught her daughters, when they were old enough, how to recognize changes in the wind, how to stock a shelter, how to make decisions quickly when conditions turned. She didn't talk about the blizzard as a dramatic event. She talked about it as a lesson in paying attention. The hidden room beneath the barn wasn't unique in concept, but it was unique in execution. Most root cellars were dug for storage and happened to serve as storm shelters when necessary. Beret's room was designed from the beginning as a place where someone could live, even if only for a few days, even if the world above became completely inaccessible. The stovepipe, the ventilation, the careful reinforcement of the ceiling, these weren't afterthoughts. She had built the room the way someone builds a lifeboat. Something you hope you never need, but construct as if your life depends on it, because it might. In the decades after the 1888 blizzard, the township records for Lincoln County show an increase in the number of homesteads with secondary shelters, often described simply as storm cellars or dugouts. Some of them were clearly modeled after what Beret had done. Small underground rooms with independent heating and ventilation, stocked with supplies and accessible from barns or outbuildings. The practice spread quietly, passed along through conversations between neighbors, through the shared understanding that survival on the prairie required redundancy, that you couldn't rely on a single structure or a single plan, Beret's daughters, Anna and Ingrid, both married and settled in the region, and both built homes with similar features. Anna's house, near Ruthton, had a reinforced cellar with a separate entrance from the outside, designed so that if the main house became blocked or dangerous, the family could still access shelter. Ingrid's home closer to Tyler had a dugout room built into the side of a low hill, insulated with sod and stocked year-round with food and fuel. They didn't talk about these spaces as monuments to their mother's foresight. They talked about them as common sense, as something anyone would do if they understood the stakes. All died in 1903, and Beret moved into town the following year, living in a small house on the north edge of Lake Benton until her death in 1917.